My husband said, "My secretary is more of a wife than you." So, I promoted her to his divorce lawyer. The silk of my red lingerie felt like ice against my skin. I had spent 2 hours getting ready, hoping to find the man I married 10 years ago inside the cold shell of the husband I had now. When Julian walked into the master bedroom, he didn't even look at my face. He checked his expensive gold watch and sighed, a sound full of boredom and annoyance. I reached out to touch his arm, but he stepped back as if my skin were toxic. "Don't bother, Mary," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet room like a serrated blade. He looked me up and down with total disgust. "My secretary, Sarah, already handled my dinner, my schedule, and my needs today. Honestly, she is more of a wife than you will ever be." He turned and walked out, leaving me trembling alone in the dark. Then, I heard him moan her name into his phone. I lay in our massive, California king bed, but it felt like a frozen tundra. The walls of our mansion were thick, but they weren't thick enough to drown out the sound of Julian's muffled, flirtatious laughter coming from the hallway. He wasn't even trying to hide his betrayal anymore. For months, he had been gaslighting me, telling me I was lazy and that I contributed nothing to his firm. He conveniently forgot that my family's seed money was the only reason his business existed in the first place. I felt small, discarded, and foolish. As the house fell silent, I got up and checked his suit jacket, which he had tossed over a chair. Deep inside the pocket, my fingers curled around a crumpled receipt. It was for a diamond bracelet worth $10,000. I looked at my own bare wrists and felt a sob rise in my throat. I wasn't the one wearing it. The next morning, I couldn't sit at home and wonder anymore. I drove to Julian's office, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors, the air was thick with a scent I didn't recognize, a heavy, musky perfume that smelled like expensive sin. I walked toward his private suite and stopped dead in my tracks. Through the crack in the door, I saw Sarah. She was leaning low over his desk, her hand resting dangerously close to his zipper while they pretended to review files. The way they looked at each other wasn't about business. It was primal, hungry, and deeply humiliating to witness. I walked in, my face burning with shame. Instead of pulling away, Julian stood up and glared at me. He told me to go home immediately because I was embarrassing him in front of the help. I was the wife, but I felt like the intruder. 2 days later, Julian announced he was leaving for a weekend retreat in Aspen. He claimed it was just for the executive team to discuss the new quarterly goals. I stood by the window and watched as Sarah loaded a suitcase into the back of his car. Through the sheer mesh of her bag, I could see lace teddies and silk robes, things you don't need for a business meeting in the mountains. The betrayal felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. As they backed out of the driveway, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text from an unknown number, but I knew it was her. It was a mistyped message that said, "He tastes so much better than your home cooking." My world tilted. If you want to see how I make them pay, hit subscribe for more revenge stories. With Julian gone to Aspen, the house felt like a tomb, but it was finally quiet enough for me to think. I knew Julian kept a private safe in the back of his home office. He thought I didn't know the code, but I had watched him enter it 100 times. My hands shook as I clicked the tumblers into place. Inside, I found a thick blue folder. It was worse than I thought. He had been siphoning millions of our marital assets into a private account in the Cayman Islands. But then, I found the real shocker. I found a hidden transcript from a legal board. Sarah wasn't just a secretary. She was actually a bar attorney who had lost her license years ago due to a massive clerical error. I stared at the papers in the dim light. I realized Sarah wasn't just his lover. She was the one legally protecting his thefts from me. The silence of the house was broken by a chime on my laptop. A friend from college, who happened to be staying at the same luxury resort in Aspen, sent me a video link. I clicked it, my breath catching in my throat. The footage was grainy but clear enough to shatter my soul. There they were, Julian and Sarah, in the heated outdoor pool under the moonlight. Their bodies were intertwined, moving together with a frantic intimacy that made me feel physically sick. They looked completely oblivious to the world, lost in a bubble of their own making. It was disgusting, especially because I knew that every second of their passion was being funded by my own inheritance. They were swimming in my money while laughing at my existence. That night, Julian called me. He sounded bored and tired, claiming he was working late on a merger. He told me I needed to stop being so needy before hanging up. When Julian returned from Aspen, he didn't bring a gift or an apology. Instead, he walked through the door and looked at me with a sneer. He told me I looked haggard and unkempt, as if being cheated on was supposed to make me glow. He sat at the kitchen island and suggested, without a hint of irony, that I should take tips from Sarah. He said she knew how to be feminine and attentive in a way I had clearly forgotten. To make matters even worse, he announced that he had invited her over for dinner that very evening. He claimed they needed to consult on our joint taxes since she was so good with numbers. I spent the afternoon cooking while my heart turned to stone. During dinner, I dropped my fork. As I reached down to grab it, I saw Sarah's foot rubbing against Julian's leg under the table, right in front of me. I waited until Sarah left our house that night, then I grabbed my keys and followed her at a safe distance. I expected her to go to a luxury apartment, but she drove to a dimly lit parking lot on the edge of town. Instead of going inside a building, she met a mysterious man in a dark SUV. I parked behind a dumpster and watched through my binoculars. They weren't kissing. They were arguing fiercely over a thick envelope of cash. Sarah looked stressed, her perfect mask slipping for the first time. I realized then that the perfect secretary might be playing a much more dangerous game than just being a mistress. She had her own secrets. I pulled out my phone and recorded the entire exchange. Just before they parted, the man shouted something that made my blood run cold. He called her counselor. The plot was much deeper than a simple affair. The next morning, I went into Julian's home office to look for more financial records. As I stepped toward his desk, I felt something crunch under my shoe. I looked down and gasped. My mother's vintage pearls, the ones I was supposed to wear to our upcoming 10th anniversary, were shattered on the floor. These were my only physical connection to my late mother. Later that afternoon, I saw why they were on the floor. Sarah had posted a cute selfie on her private Instagram account. She was wearing my pearls, smiling brightly, while sitting in my husband's lap. When I confronted Julian about the broken necklace later that evening, he didn't even look up from his laptop. "They looked better on her anyway," he said coldly. "You don't have the neck for pearls, Mary. You've let yourself go." I stared at him, realizing the man I loved was officially dead. It was finally the night of our 10th anniversary gala. This was supposed to be a celebration of us, but Julian spent the entire night dancing with Sarah. He introduced her to the board of directors as the true backbone of his success. I was relegated to the dark corner of the ballroom with the other wives, women who were ignored and talked over. I watched as Julian leaned in and whispered into Sarah's ear, making her laugh that high, tinkling laugh I had grown to hate. Then, Julian stepped onto the stage and grabbed the microphone. The room went silent as he made a shocking announcement. He was making Sarah a partner in the firm. I felt the floor drop out from under me. By making her a partner, he was effectively giving her my shares, the shares bought with my family's money. If you're ready for the payback, hit subscribe for more revenge. I knew I needed more leverage, so I tracked down the man in the dark SUV. His name was Marcus, and he was Sarah's ex-husband. We met in a crowded coffee shop where nobody would notice us. He was a disgraced lawyer himself, looking tired and beaten down by life. He told me a story that changed everything. Sarah hadn't actually lost her license because of a simple clerical error. She had it suspended for unethical behavior and hiding assets for clients. He also revealed that her suspension was about to end, and she was preparing for a massive comeback. Marcus looked at me with pity and handed me a small, black flash drive. "This contains Sarah's real specialty," he whispered. "She doesn't do corporate law, Mary. She specializes in predatory divorce. She finds wealthy men, drains them, and moves on." I gripped the drive so hard it left a mark on my palm. The game was finally beginning to change. When I got home, Julian was waiting for me in the living room. He didn't look like a husband. He looked like a landlord about to evict a tenant. He told me he wanted a trial separation immediately. He looked me in the eye and said I had become toxic, paranoid, and impossible to live with. He claimed he was doing this for my own mental health, but I knew better. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the coffee table. He offered me a measly $50,000 to walk away from our multi-million-dollar estate and the firm my parents funded. It was an insulting pittance, a crumb from the feast I had provided. Sarah will be the one drafting the fair agreement, he said with a smug, self-satisfied grin. Since she's the new partner, she knows the books better than anyone. Just sign it and save us both the trouble. That night, I sat in my dark living room, staring at the flash drive Marcus had given me. I plugged it into my laptop and watched as the files loaded. It was a roadmap of destruction. I saw the pattern clearly now. Sarah finds wealthy, arrogant men who feel underappreciated by their wives. She becomes their everything, helps them hide money from their spouses, and then bleeds them dry during the divorce process. Julian thought he had found a beautiful, loyal mistress who finally understood him. I realized he had actually found his own executioner. He was so blinded by his own ego that he couldn't see he was being hunted. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I wasn't going to cry anymore. I picked up my phone and dialed Sarah's private number. It was time to make the predator an offer she couldn't refuse. I met Sarah in secret at a high-end hotel bar. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I didn't call her names. I simply opened my laptop and showed her the evidence of Julian's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I watched her eyes carefully. When she saw the actual numbers, millions of dollars Julian had been hiding even from her, I saw a flash of pure, unadulterated greed flare in her pupils. She realized Julian was holding out on her, too. I leaned in close, the scent of her musky perfume no longer intimidating me. Why settle for a mistress's salary or a small partner share when you can have a lawyer's fee on the whole estate? Asked her. Julian is a thief, Sarah. He's stealing from both of us. Let's work together to make sure he loses everything. She took a long sip of her martini and smiled. Sarah and I reached an agreement that night. She would play the long game as a double agent. She would continue servicing Julian and making him feel like he was the most powerful, invincible man in the world. Meanwhile, I would funnel her all the secret financial information she needed to get her law license fully reinstated under a new, independent firm that I would secretly fund. Julian would think his mistress was helping him win, while she was actually building the cage that would trap him forever. I felt a cold shiver of excitement as we shook hands. The man who thought I was nothing had no idea that his two wives were now his greatest enemies. As I walked to my car, Julian sent me a text. Sarah says you're finally being reasonable and accepting the separation. Good girl. I laughed out loud. He had no idea what was coming. Over the next week, Julian got bolder and more reckless than I ever imagined. He started taking Sarah on massive shopping sprees using our joint credit card, the one I had worked years to keep in good standing. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications that felt like tiny stabs to my heart. Gucci, Prada, Cartier, the list went on and on. He was buying her the life he told me I didn't deserve. I sat at my kitchen table, watching thousands of dollars vanish in minutes. Every cent he spent was another nail I was prepared to hammer into his coffin. I didn't call him to complain or beg him to stop. Instead, I sent Sarah a private, encrypted text message. Make sure he buys the big diamonds. They are much easier to liquidate for cash later. She sent back a thumb-up emoji. Julian thought he was being a big spender, but he was just buying my future freedom. A few days later, we attended a high-profile charity auction for the local children's hospital. It was the kind of event where everyone who was anyone in the city showed up. When a luxury vacation package to the Maldives came up for bid, Julian stood up and outbid everyone in the room. He spent $50,000 in a single minute. The crowd cheered, assuming the romantic trip was for him and his loyal wife of 10 years. Julian looked me right in the eye, his face twisted in a cruel, triumphant smirk. Then, he turned and handed the gold-trimmed ticket directly to Sarah, who was sitting at our table. The room went dead silent. I could feel the pitying stares of 100 people burning into the back of my neck. I didn't flinch. I just adjusted my dress, took a slow sip of expensive champagne, and smiled. Julian was so intoxicated by his own perceived power that he completely lost his sense of caution. He believed Sarah was his ultimate protector, a legal shark who would devour me and leave him with every penny. He was so convinced of her devotion that he signed over a final, sweeping power of attorney to her. He told his friends he was finally protecting his hard-earned assets from that crazy, bitter wife. He felt so untouchable that he stopped coming home to the main house altogether. He didn't even bother making excuses about working late or business trips anymore. He was finished with the charade of our marriage. He spent the weekend moving Sarah's things into our guest house, which sat right across the garden from my bedroom window. He wanted me to watch them together. He wanted me to break, but I was just getting started. The next morning, I walked into my kitchen to make coffee and stopped in my tracks. Sarah was standing there, leaning against my marble counter. She was wearing my favorite silk robe, the one my father had bought me, and drinking from my favorite hand-painted ceramic mug. She looked at me with a look of pure, chilly triumph. "He likes it when I pretend to be you, Mary," she whispered, her voice like a snake sliding through grass. "He says it's a turn-on for him to see me in your things while you watch from the sidelines. It makes him feel like he's finally won." I felt a surge of rage, but I forced myself to stay calm. I realized Sarah was starting to enjoy the wife role a little too much for comfort. She was playing her part perfectly, but the line between acting and reality was starting to blur dangerously. My brother, Leo, who works as a high-end private investigator, called me with a serious warning. He had been tailing the couple as part of our plan, but he saw something that didn't fit the script. He had spotted Julian and Sarah at a prestigious jewelry store downtown, and they weren't looking at bracelets. They were huddled over a tray of massive, sparkling engagement rings. Leo sounded worried over the phone. "Mary, you need to be careful," he warned. "She's looking at him with real stars in her eyes. Is she actually falling for him, or is the prize just getting bigger and more tempting?" I stared out the window at the guest house, my mind racing. If Sarah flipped back to his side, I would lose everything. I had to make sure the trap was set so tight that she couldn't escape it either. Sarah presented Julian with what she called a pre-divorce protection plan. They sat in the guest house, the glow of expensive candles reflecting off the windows. Julian was so blinded by her supposed devotion and the way she handled him in the bedroom that he didn't even ask for a lawyer to review it. He truly believed Sarah was his shield against my greed. He signed the thick stack of papers with a flourish, laughing about how I would be left with nothing but the clothes on my back. He didn't bother reading the fine print in the back of the document. If he had, he would have seen a small, buried clause. The document actually linked every single one of his hidden offshore accounts and local holdings to a designated legal compliance officer. That officer was me. He had just handed me the keys to his entire secret kingdom while thinking he was locking me out. The following night, Julian came back to the main house for the last time. He didn't come to talk. He came to pack his final bags. He was incredibly cruel, standing in the middle of our bedroom and telling me I was nothing without his name and his money. He went into graphic, disgusting detail about why Sarah was better in bed, trying to break my spirit one last time before he walked out. He called me boring, old, and useless. I didn't cry. I didn't even argue. I just stood there with my phone hidden in my palm, recording every single word of his verbal abuse and his admissions of hiding money. I wanted a record of his true face. "You're a ghost, Mary," he spat as he zipped his suitcase. "And Sarah is the future." He walked out the door, slamming it so hard the windows rattled in their frames. A few days later, the atmosphere changed. Julian found out that Sarah had been frequently meeting with a mysterious investor at a high-end office building downtown. Because he is a narcissist, he immediately became jealous and violent. He didn't think about business. He thought she was cheating on him with another man. He began tracking her phone, his face twisted with rage and suspicion. He couldn't stand the idea of losing his perfect wife to someone else. He finally tracked her GPS signal to a massive, modern office building with floor-to-ceiling glass windows. He stormed out of his car, his fists clenched, ready to catch her in the act and humiliate her. He burst through the revolving doors and demanded to know which office Sarah Vance was in. He fought his way past the security desk, screaming her name like a madman, ready for a bloody confrontation. Julian burst into the corner office on the top floor, ready to catch Sarah with another man. He was breathing hard, his face red with anger. But instead of finding her in another man's arms, he found her sitting behind a massive, mahogany desk. She wasn't wearing a secretary's uniform. She was dressed in a $5,000 power suit with her hair pulled back sharply. She looked like a queen on her throne. The office was silent, smelling of expensive leather and success. Julian stopped in his tracks, his mouth hanging open in confusion. He looked at the door he had just kicked open. On the frosted glass, in bold gold letters, it read, Sarah Vance, ESQ, Lead Divorce Counsel. He looked from the sign to Sarah, his brain struggling to make sense of the scene. What is this? He stammered. What are you doing here, Sarah? Julian started to laugh, a nervous, high-pitched sound. What is this, Sarah? Some kind of roleplay? Is this a joke? Sarah didn't smile. She didn't even blink. She slowly slid a thick, heavy stack of legal papers across the polished mahogany desk toward him. Julian, you are being served, she said, her voice as cold as a winter morning. I've spent the last few months gathering every detail of your fraud, and I'm officially representing your wife in this divorce. Julian's face turned a sickly shade of gray as the reality hit him like a physical blow. His mistress was no longer his lover. She was now his greatest legal enemy. He looked at the papers, then at her, realizing that every secret he had whispered in her ear was now a weapon she was going to use against him in court. The betrayal he felt was nothing compared to the trap he had walked into. Julian let out a frantic, jagged laugh, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the mahogany desk. You can't do this. The agreement I signed, the one you drafted, it protects me. It says all my assets are private. Sarah leaned back in her chair, a sharp, predatory smile spreading across her face. She looked at him with pity, the way a scientist looks at a bug under a microscope. Julian, you didn't read the conflict of interest clause, she said calmly. By acting as your advisor, while being your mistress, I made those documents legally voidable. But more importantly, the protection plan you signed actually gave me the power to audit your accounts for compliance. I've already turned everything over to Mary's forensic team. Julian's knees buckled. He realized that every asset he had tried to hide was now legally frozen by the court. He was penniless until the trial ended. While Julian was still reeling in Sarah's office, I arrived at our mansion with 2 massive moving trucks and a team of professional movers. I wasn't there to pack my things. I was there to pack his. I stood on the front lawn, holding a court order that granted me exclusive use of the property. Since the house was purchased entirely with my family's inheritance money and Julian had admitted in writing that Sarah was living in the guest house, the judge moved with lightning speed. The neighbors began to gather on the sidewalk, whispering and pointing as the movers hauled out Julian's designer suits, his gym equipment, and his precious wine collection. I watched as they piled his belongings into the trucks like common trash. Julian arrived just in time to see his life being emptied into the street. He was forced to leave in his silk pajamas while the neighborhood watched his downfall. 2 weeks later, we stood in a preliminary hearing. The courtroom was cold and smelled of old paper and wax. Julian sat at the defense table, looking like a ghost of the man he used to be. Sarah stood at the podium, sharp and lethal. She didn't hold back. She detailed every single time Julian had used company funds to buy her love, presenting receipts for the Gucci bags, the Prada shoes, and the Cartier jewelry. Then she dropped the ultimate bomb. She submitted the Aspen videos, the ones showing their moonlit swim, as clear evidence of his financial infidelity. She argued that he had spent marital assets on a mistress while claiming the business was struggling. Julian's own board of directors was watching the hearing via a private live stream I had arranged. If you want to see him lose his company too, hit subscribe for more. The fallout from the hearing was instantaneous and devastating. Because the partner position Julian had given Sarah was based on fraudulent filings and hidden company debts, the board of directors held an emergency meeting. They were horrified by the evidence of Julian's financial misconduct and the way he had risked the firm's reputation for an affair. By a unanimous vote, they stripped Julian of his CEO title and removed him from the board entirely. He went from being the king of the industry to just another disgraced employee of the company my parents had started. The board reached out to me that afternoon, desperate to save the firm's stock price. By 5 o'clock, I was officially named the interim chairwoman of the board. I walked into Julian's old office and took his chair. It felt a little cold, but it fit me perfectly. Desperate and alone, Julian tried to crawl back to Sarah. He waited for her outside her new office building, begging her to drop the case and run away with him to Europe. He told her he had one last secret account she didn't know about, promising they could start over if she just betrayed me one last time. Sarah stood there with her phone in her hand, recording every single word. She listened as he admitted to years of systematic tax evasion and embezzlement to save their future. He cried, thinking he was winning her back with his honesty. Sarah didn't say a word. As soon as he finished his confession, she hit stop on the recording and sent the file directly to me and the IRS. She looked at Julian with utter contempt and said, "I told you, Julian. I'm a very good wife. I handle everything." With the IRS closing in and his board of directors breathing down his neck, Julian reached a state of pure, unrefined panic. He decided to do the only thing a coward knows how to do: run. He packed a single carry-on bag with stolen office supplies and a few gold watches, then drove a rental car to the airport, hoping to catch a flight to a country without an extradition treaty. He stood at the check-in counter, sweating through his expensive shirt, and handed over his Premier credit card. The agent swiped it once, then twice. "I'm sorry, sir. This card has been declined." Julian fumbled for his secret emergency card, but that one was declined too. Every single line of credit had been snapped shut by the court order Sarah and I had filed that morning. He was stuck in the terminal, penniless and trapped. Security eventually escorted him out for screaming at the staff and causing a public scene. A week later, I sat across from Julian in a cold, sterile deposition room. The air was thick with the smell of cheap coffee and Julian's desperation. He looked disheveled, his eyes bloodshot and his hands shaking as he gripped a plastic water bottle. Sarah sat right next to me, looking sharp, lethal, and entirely unimpressed by his presence. I leaned across the table, making sure he could see the calm, steady look in my eyes. I leaned in and whispered, "She really is a much better wife than me, Julian. She's taking every single thing you own, just like a good wife should." Julian's face twisted with a sudden, primal rage. He let out a roar and lunged across the table at me, his fingers clawing at the air. Before he could even touch my sleeve, my brother Leo stepped out from the corner and pinned him firmly to the floor. As Julian lay pinned to the carpet, gasping for breath, Sarah dropped the final piece of the puzzle. She pulled a document from her briefcase that showed the funding for her new law firm. Julian's eyes widened as he scanned the lines. He found out that Sarah's massive law school debt and the heavy costs of getting her license reinstated had been paid for by a blind trust months ago. He finally connected the dots that had been right in front of him. He realized that I had been Sarah's boss and financial benefactor for the entire duration of their affair. Every romantic dinner, every secret meeting, and every legal move she made had been orchestrated by me from the very beginning. He looked at us both, his face turning a ghostly white. He finally realized that his entire infidelity wasn't his idea at all. It was a carefully curated trap. The scandal finally broke in the national news. A major outlet picked up the story with a headline, "The CEO, the secretary, and the sovereign wife." The article detailed Julian's spectacular fall from grace, including the embezzlement, the affair, and the way his own mistress turned into his legal executioner. Julian's reputation was completely nuked. No firm in the city would even pick up the phone if they heard his name. He became a cautionary tale for every arrogant executive who thought they were smarter than their spouse. Meanwhile, Sarah's new law firm, Vance and Associates received over 100 new client inquiries in a single day. People were lining up to hire the woman who had dismantled a multimillionaire with such surgical precision. We had turned a tawdry affair into a brand of justice that the whole world wanted to buy. We finally met Julian and his court-appointed lawyer to offer him a final settlement deal. We sat in a room with a single window overlooking the city Julian used to think he owned. The deal was simple but devastating. Julian had to sign over his remaining 40% of the firm, his vacation properties, and all his remaining personal assets. If he refused, Sarah would hand over the recordings of his tax evasion and embezzlement confessions directly to the district attorney. He would be looking at least 10 years in a federal prison. I watched him stare at the pen in his hand like it was a loaded gun. "You have 24 hours to sign, Julian," Sarah said, checking her watch with a cold smile. "Either you walk away as a nobody or you walk into a jail cell. The choice is yours." Julian spent that night in a cheap, crumbling motel on the outskirts of the city. The neon sign outside his window flickered, casting a sickly green light over his tiny room. At 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was Julian. He was crying, his voice breaking into jagged sobs as he apologized for everything. He told me he was confused, that he had been under a lot of pressure, and that deep down, he still loved me. He begged me to remember our early years before the money changed him. I didn't say a single word. Instead, I quietly tapped my screen and put him on speakerphone for Sarah, who was sitting across from me in my new living room. Sarah let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed through the line. "That is the exact same line you used on me in Aspen, Julian," she said coldly. "Be original for once. It's over." The next morning, Julian walked into the conference room to sign the final papers. I had arranged for a small group of cameras to be present. I wanted his surrender to be a matter of public record. He looked ancient, his skin sallow, and his suit hanging off his shrunken frame. He was officially a nobody. He picked up the pen with a trembling hand and scrawled his name on the documents that stripped him of his wealth, his career, and his dignity. After he finished, he looked up at Sarah with a hollow, haunted expression. "Did you ever actually love me, Sarah?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah didn't hesitate. She looked down at the 5-carat diamond ring on her finger, the bonus I had bought her for her loyalty, and smiled. "I love your assets, Julian," she replied. "It's just too bad that they all belong to me and Mary now." 1 hour after the signing, I walked into the firm's headquarters as the official, permanent CEO. The employees stood and watched in silence as I took my place at the head of the long boardroom table. My first official act was to sign a contract hiring Sarah Vance as the firm's chief legal officer. We weren't just a wife and a lawyer anymore. We were the ultimate power duo. We had turned a betrayal into an empire. As we walked out of the building together, the cool afternoon air felt refreshing on my face. At the edge of the property, I saw a man standing by the bus stop. It was Julian, clutching a single plastic bag of his belongings. He looked at us, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope, and started to walk toward us, begging for a bus pass. We didn't even slow down. That evening, Sarah and I shared a toast at the same 5-star restaurant where Julian used to ignore me. We sat at the best table in the house, the one with the view of the harbor. We didn't talk about Julian. He was a ghost that had finally been exorcised. We talked about the future, about expansion, and about the new clients flooding into Sarah's firm. I realized then that Julian's betrayal was actually a gift. It had stripped away a dead marriage and given me the best business partner I had ever had. We laughed, the sound bright and genuine, as we planned our next move. I felt lighter than I had in a decade. However, as the waiter brought our check, I felt my phone vibrate in my purse. I pulled it out and saw a text from an unknown number. "He's not the only one with secrets, Mary." I went home to my new penthouse and poured a glass of wine. I stood by the fireplace and watched as the final divorce decree turned into ash and smoke. I looked at Sarah, who was leaning against the mantel, and I felt a surge of cold determination. "Ready for the next one?" I asked softly. I pulled a photograph out of my desk drawer. It was a picture of the man who had tried to help Julian hide his money in the beginning, the high-ranking senator who thought he was untouchable. Sarah took the photo, her eyes narrowing with a sharp, predatory glint. The camera of my mind zoomed in on my own reflection in the window. My eyes were like flint. Julian was right about one thing. Sarah really is the perfect wife. My wife. We are partners in everything now. If this story stayed with you, like the video, subscribe for more powerful revenge stories, and tell me in the comments what part hit you the hardest.